This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Wednesday, so that means it's time for another deck history. In this series I look at various archetypes that have found competitive success at Magic's highest level of competition, tracing their development from when they first emerged on the scene all the way up to the modern day. As usual, I ran a poll to determine the topic of this week's video, and Delver won out. It was actually a pretty interesting poll because I posted it just a few hours before it was revealed that the deck's namesake, Delver of Secrets, was receiving a reprint in Innistrad Midnight Hunt. For those first few hours, Splinter Twin was actually in pretty good position to win the poll, but the reprint of Delver flipped things, and obviously people want to hear about a deck that is more topical right now. Anyway, Delver decks get their name from that aforementioned Delver of Secrets, and they are generally aggro control decks that play 1 or 2 mana creatures early that get larger, and then protect those creatures with counter magic while also removing any creatures that get in their way. Because these decks want to flip Delver of Secrets into Insectile Aberration as quickly as possible, these decks are loaded up with instants and sorceries. And in these decks, it's effectively a 1-mana 3/2 flyer. In short, it's a control deck, but unlike typical control decks, it's reliant on cheap creatures to get the job done, and that's where we get aggro control from. At one time or another, Delver decks have found success in Standard, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and in this video we'll trace the origins of the deck in various formats and discuss how and why they changed over time. The story of Delver decks begins in the Standard of 2011, not long after it was printed in original Innistrad, and by 2012 the deck put up its first top 8 at a premier event. In fact, at Grand Prix Orlando in 2012, 2 blue-white Delver decks made the top 8. One of these was piloted by Hall of Famer Paulo Vitor Damo de Rosa, and you can see the kind of strategy at work here. The deck jams in a bunch of instants and sorceries so that the Delver is easy to transform. One of the notable ones is Ponder, which also gave you the ability to manipulate the top of your deck, virtually guaranteeing that your Delver of Secrets would transform on the subsequent turn. The deck also ran a couple of other spell payoffs in the form of Snapcaster Mage, which could give spells in your graveyard flashback, and Rune Chanter's Pike, which loved it when spells were in your graveyard. Putting one on a Delver was pretty nice, but it was actually even more potent with the deck's pair of hexproof creatures, Geist of St. Trapt and Invisible Stalker, the latter of which couldn't be blocked either. So you can see this aggro control strategy at work here. The main plan is to play out cheap evasive creatures, cast counter magic and bounce spells, and then use various spell synergies to take out the opponent. Later in 2012, a couple of new Delver variants emerged at Pro Tour Dark Ascension. One of these, piloted by Deniz Rashid, added a tribal human element. Most of the cards that Delver decks were already playing happened to be humans, including the Delver, Snapcaster Mage, and Geist. So, Deniz decided to go harder in that direction and include Champion of the Parish, which gave the deck a second 1-mana creature that would eventually be a very real threat despite the low mana investment. The deck still went heavy on spells, but it could simultaneously fulfill the human and spell synergies the deck was after with a card like Gather the Townsfolk, a spell which generated human creature tokens. The other new Delver variant at Pro Tour Dark Ascension was Esper, and it was piloted by Hall of Famer John Finkel. It also added a tribal element, but instead of humans, it went with spirits. The deck ran the powerful Spirit Lord, Drogskull Captain, as well as Dungeon Geists, which added an efficient body to the board while locking down an opposing creature. Just like Deniz Rashid's deck also played a token maker to simultaneously satisfy the spell and tribal requirements of the deck, Finkel's deck ran black to gain access to the powerful Lingering Souls, a card which gave you 4 1/1 spirits between casting it normally and flashing it back. And obviously, those are pretty scary with the lords in play. These 2 tribal variants of Delver began appearing pretty regularly throughout the competitive scene. However, blue-white Delver decks without a tribal element didn't completely disappear, as you can see from Matthew Costa's deck that top-8'd Grand Prix Baltimore later in the year, which is not very different from the deck piloted by Paulo Vitor Damo de Rosa earlier that year, and in fact the most common decks going forward were still the blue-white variant without any tribal stuff going on, and really, these decks underwent very minimal change between 2012 and when the deck rotated out of Standard in 2013. The last Delver deck to put up a top 8 in Standard came at Grand Prix Kitakyushu in 2013, and it was piloted by Yuta Takahashi. The deck's plan was pretty much the same, with the only major difference being the inclusion of Restoration Angel, a creature that could be a threat on its own, but it could also save your creatures from removal and allow you to rebuy Snapcaster Mages into the battlefield ability. This marked the end of Delver in Standard, at least for the time it did. Delver of Secrets is now legal in Standard all over again as a result of the reprint in Innistrad Midnight Hunt I mentioned earlier, and it seems like it has a decent chance at finding more success in Standard going forward. A 1-mana 3/2 with flying is just too good. It's still too early to tell for sure if Delver decks will be legitimate in Standard, but here's a look at the kind of deck people are testing right now. Jeff Hoogland has tried a few different Delver variants on his streams, and the one that he's had the most success with is this one, Blue-Black Delver Tokens. It uses Delver, of course, and the other spell payoffs the deck runs produce tokens. One of these is Poppet Stitcher, and the other is Sedgemoor Witch. It's worth noting that Delver decks are also legal in Historic as a result of this printing, and it will be interesting to see if Historic Delver decks emerge. It seems more likely that they're going to show up in Historic than Standard, but for now, there's not really a Historic history to talk about. But for now, we don't really have a Historic Delver deck to talk about. Now, let's move to discussing Delver decks in other formats. Let's take a look at Modern first, where Delver decks first emerged on the scene in 2012. The first modern Delver decks were in Temur colors. 2 decks of this type top-8'd Grand Prix Turin in 2012, and Antonino De Rosa's version of the deck won the entire event. Modern has a much larger card pool, of course, so this version of Delver was significantly different. Obviously, Delver of the Secrets is in the deck, as well as Snapcaster Mage, but some other creatures made their way to the deck too. The deck primarily played green to gain access to Tarmogoyf, another creature that fits this theme of cheap and gets bigger as the game goes on, and Vendilion Click was also a nice inclusion, since it was both a real threat in the air and a card that could disrupt the opponent. The deck also used significantly different sets of spells. There was of course Counter Magic, but red gave the deck access to efficient burn spells like Lightning Bolt and Burst Lightning. Meanwhile, Serum Visions gave the deck a way to manipulate the top of the library so that the Delver would flip more easily. Ponder was banned at this point in Modern, so Serum Visions was the best card for the job. This is more or less what Delver decks in Modern looked like for the remainder of 2012 and throughout 2013 before undergoing a fairly large change in 2014. The deck was still Temur, but it added some new cards. At Grand Prix Madrid that year, Emmanuel Gershenson won the whole event with his Temur Delver deck, and it utilized 2 new cards. One of these was Magic 2014's Young Pyromancer, which gave the deck access to another powerful spell payoff. The deck was already filled to the brim with cheap, efficient spells, so adding a 1/1 to every single one of those was a reasonable way to win the game. Basically, the deck could just play the way it had always played, but now it had Young Pyromancer to spit out these tokens. While Young Pyromancer isn't technically one creature that gets bigger throughout the game, it was still a card that allowed a control deck to add to the board while interacting with what the opponent was doing, and that was a powerful thing. The other key card was Khans of Tarkir's Treasure Cruise. The deck could quickly load the graveyard with fetch lands as well as all the cheap spells it liked to cast, so Treasure Cruise was heavily discounted on a regular basis, providing serious fuel for the Pyromancer and continuing to give you more spells. The addition of a card with the Delve mechanic also made the Delver name have a double meaning. These 2 cards powered up Delver decks big time, so much so that in January of 2015, Treasure Cruise was banned out of Modern. However, Young Pyromancer would stick around and go on to be a common running mate of Delver of Secrets. In 2016, Delver decks transitioned from Temur and blue-red builds to Grixis. That year, Albertus Law won Grand Prix Guangzhou with a Grixis Delver deck. The deck's core largely remained the same, but giving up green obviously meant no Tarmogoyf. Additionally, black gave the deck access to some powerful options. Treasure Cruise had really shown how well Delver decks could abuse the graveyard, and that was banned, so Grixis Delver decks continued with that theme, adding Delve creatures Tasigur and Gurmag Angler, who could easily cost a single black mana in the deck. Black also meant the deck could play powerful spells like Kolaghan's Command and Terminate. The command almost always gives you a 2-for-1, and Terminate can answer almost anything at instant speed. This became the dominant form of Delver for a while, but Gitaxian Probe got banned in 2017, dealing another blow to the deck. Gitaxian Probe being a free spell was a big deal because it could help you quickly load your graveyard while ripping through your deck, and it could also transform your Delver, and it could also make a creature token with Young Pyromancer. And thereafter, it didn't find quite as much success. The last modern deck to top 8 a major event was Cha21's Blue-Red Delver, which top 8'd the Magic Online Modern Championship in 2018. This version no longer used Young Pyromancer, but added Grim Lavamancer as a way to gain value out of all the spells in the graveyard. It also added in Nimble Obstructionist, a nicely flexible card that could disrupt the opponent to go along with Vendilion Click. Delver decks haven't managed to top 8 in Modern since 2018, and they aren't a major force in the format these days. But we still have two formats to talk about. Let's talk about Legacy next. Legacy is the format where Delver decks have enjoyed the most consistent success, and Delver decks have been Tier 1 in the format since it was printed in 2011. The first deck to feature the Delver plan in Legacy was Canadian Threshold. While the deck didn't have Delver in the name, the deck will look quite familiar. This is the deck that Ciro Bonaventura top 8'd Grand Prix Amsterdam with in 2011. It was Teamer, and like all the Delver decks we've seen, jammed full of a bunch of spells and cheap creatures that become larger. The Threshold part of the name here comes from Nimble Mongoose, which becomes a 3/3 once you hit Threshold, and alongside Delver, this gave the deck access to both a 1-mana 3/2 with Flying and a 1-mana 3/3 with Shroud. Legacy was great for transforming Delver too, because it had access to more spells that allowed you to manipulate the top of your library. In Legacy, you could run both Ponder and Brainstorm. So it was trivially easy to transform Delver of Secrets into Insectile Aberration in Legacy, and it still is, and that's part of what has powered its dominance in the format. Threshold decks like this one continue to find success throughout 2011 and 2013. By 2013, the first Legacy deck emerged bearing the Delver name, with two Delver decks finishing in the top 8 at Grand Prix Denver. As you can see, though, the deck didn't vary wildly from the earlier Threshold decks, still packing in Delver, Nimble Mongoose, and Tarmogoyf as the threats. It also added red for cards like Grim Lavamancer and Lightning Bolt, which we saw a lot of in Modern. Another deck to top 8 the event was significantly different from what we've already seen, though. Daniel Signorini's Bug Delver deck swapped out red for black, and it also ran Deathrite Shaman instead of Young Pyromancer or Nimble Mongoose. The Shaman provided yet another cheap, powerful creature for the deck, and this one was a serious Swiss Army knife. It could turn lands into graveyards into mana, it could exile cards to gain life, or make your opponent lose it. Green also meant the deck got to play Abrupt Decay, a powerful spell in the format that can kill most permanents people play, and Hymn to Turok, arguably the best discard spell in all of Magic's history. Another neat thing about this deck was its use of Sylvan Library, a powerful card advantage engine that makes you lose significant life, but this deck could take advantage of the library manipulation to easily flip the Delver. In 2014, Delver decks, just like we saw in Modern, transitioned more towards Blue-Red and began playing both Young Pyromancer and Treasure Cruise. Dan Jordan's Blue-Red Delver deck also added in Monastery Swiftspear, which, you guessed it, is a 1-mana creature that can represent a very real threat thanks to spell payoffs. Treasure Cruise got banned in January of 2015, though, just like we saw with Modern. This led to the need for some new types of Delver decks. In 2015, 4-color Delver decks put up 2 top 8s at Grand Prix Lille. By going 4 colors, the deck gained access to a lot of the key cards we've seen in this video, but for the first time they were all jammed together. Red gave the deck access to powerful burn like Lightning Bolt, green allowed the deck to access Tarmogoyf, and black meant the deck could run Abrupt Decay. Obviously, blue is the base color of the deck, given that the deck needs to cast the all-important Delver and lots of powerful counter magic. Since Treasure Cruise was banned, Delver players were now turning to Dig Through Time, which had a similar effect to Treasure Cruise. For several months in 2015, Delver was probably the best deck in Legacy, with both 4-color and blue-red versions of the deck putting up impressive showings, such as putting 5 decks in the top 8 of the 2015 Legacy Championship. It eventually became clear that Dig Through Time was also too good in making blue decks, and Delver decks, even better than they needed to be, so it got banned in September of 2015, causing the deck to undergo some more changes. The deck largely reverted back to Blue-Red and Grixis in the wake of the banning, and the deck didn't look too different from the pre-Treasure Cruise, pre-Dig Through Time versions of the deck, running creatures like Delver, Deathrite Shaman, Gurmag Angler, and Young Pyromancer. However, there were more bannings in store for Delver decks as their dominance didn't really seem to have an end to it. In July of 2018, both Deathrite Shaman and Gataxian Probe were banned, and this significantly weakened the deck, taking away one of its powerful 1-drops and a free spell that allowed them to quickly load the graveyard and dig deeper into the deck. Jonathan Sukenik was the first to pilot a Delver deck to a top 8 in the wake of these bannings, and it came at 2018's Pro Tour 25th. His deck had 2 pretty notable inclusions that hadn't been consistently appearing in earlier Delver decks. The first of these was True Name Nemesis. It was more expensive than most creatures we've seen show up in Delver, but its protection from a player meant that it was incredibly difficult to interact with and it could represent a very fast clock. The deck also utilized Bitter Blossom, which gave the deck a win condition that was more difficult to deal with than a single creature. The addition of True Name Nemesis became commonplace in future Legacy Delver decks, but Bitter Blossom did not. Delver decks underwent another sizable change in 2019, though in this case it was because of a couple of new cards, and not because of a banning. Whether they were Blue-Red or Grixis, Delver decks were now running Dreadhorde Arcanist. This new card was a perfect fit for the deck because, like Young Pyromancer and the Delver, it loved spells, and especially cheap ones, as it was able to make free copies of spells in the graveyard. And if you take a good look at the spells that Daniel Savage's version of the deck runs, you'll note that most of them only cost a single mana, so the Arcanist could have a field day with the graveyard. Brazen Borrower was another new card that found its way into Legacy Delver. It gave the deck another evasive threat and one that could also be a spell that would interact with the opposing board. Since then, Delver decks have not changed a whole lot, though you do see some of them include things like Sprite Dragon. Delver decks are still a big force in Legacy today, and that's not changing anytime soon. Now, let's take a look at what Delver decks have looked like in Vintage. With both Modern and Legacy, we saw that Delver decks enjoyed some pretty consistent success for a long period of time. That's a little less true in Vintage, where the deck has been successful more sporadically. The first Delver deck to top 8 a major Vintage event came in 2013 with 2 top 8s at that year's Vintage Championship. Both of these were Teamer Delver decks, and they didn't look a whole lot different from the Legacy versions. One notable thing about Vintage, though, is that Brainstorm and Ponder are restricted, so this deck also had to run 2 Preordains in order to have 4 total cards with that type of library manipulation effect. Just like we saw in the other formats, 2014 saw Delver decks transform as a result of the powerful Treasure Cruise, and it ultimately ended up getting restricted in the format, so Delver decks these days can only run a single copy. Apart from that restriction, Delver decks have changed very little in Vintage over the last few years. And that pretty much concludes the story of Delver of Secrets. In the past, Delver decks have found a lot of success in Standard, Modern, and Vintage, and Delver decks continue to be one of the format-defining decks for Legacy. And that does it for this video. If you want to make sure you have a say in what deck I look at in next week's deck history, don't forget to vote in the poll on the community tab. If you want to make sure you catch future editions of deck history, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on older deck histories, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to support the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.